Both the helicopter and the plane crashed in the river.
At this point, we don't believe there are any survivors.
And it's horrific and extremely rare and unprecedented.
What happened yesterday shouldn't have happened.
The goal is to get safety improvements. The safest airplane in the world is the one that doesn't fly.
When Americans take off in airplanes, they should expect to land at their destination.
Tonight marks 6 weeks since the tragedy involving Flight 5342. January 29th, 67 lives were lost when the plane departing from Wichita collided midair with an Army Black Hawk helicopter just seconds before it was scheduled to land at Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. This week, the NTSB releasing their preliminary report into their investigation. In that report, they call for action from the FAA to limit helicopter traffic around that airport. Over the next 30 minutes, our investigative team digs into those findings, what recommendations are being made, and what's next to make sure a tragedy like this never happens again. We start with reporter Sean Logging breaking down what the NTSB calls serious safety concerns at Reagan Airport.
A critical safety issue must be addressed without delay.
The NTSB laying out that there is still a lot its investigation has to learn about the mid-air collision of Flight 5342 from Wichita and an Army Black Hawk helicopter on January 29th.
The quickest part of the investigation is determining what happened. The part that takes longer is the how and why.
But making clear Tuesday, action is needed, detailing data it's collected of close proximity events at and near Reagan National Airport between planes and helicopters.
Half of the encounters we reviewed, again from 2011 through 2024, the helicopter may have been above the route altitude restriction.
Jennifer Hamady with the NTSB says at least once a month between 2011 and 2024, there was a traffic collision avoidance system alert requiring immediate action. And at Reagan National between October 2021 and December 2024,
there were 15,214 occurrences or close proximity events between commercial airplanes and helicopters,
with a risk of future collisions.
An intolerable risk to aviation safety.
The NTSB urgently recommends an end to a helicopter route east of Reagan National.
It shouldn't take a tragedy like this to occur. Unfortunately, one did, and so we are calling on action, but there clearly were indicators.
The preliminary report providing information on crew experience, history of the flights, and information from the recorders. The NTSB says those black boxes are where they still have a lot of work because of limits from the recorders on the Black Hawk.
Our team has a lot of work to do.
And those findings highlight the congested airspace around Reagan National has been a problem for years. It's why the NTSB is making two rare but urgent recommendations to the FAA to limit helicopters flying in that area. The first recommendation is to ban helicopters flying on Route 4, while two runways, 15 and 33, are being used for planes landing and taking off. So take a look at this map here. The NTSB wants to eliminate that highlighted helicopter flight path from Haynes Point, directly across the river from the airport, down to Wilson Bridge, while planes are departing and arriving. This is the same route the Army Black Hawk helicopter was on when it collided with Flight 5342 just seconds before landing. The second recommendation would be to find an alternative helicopter route when that segment of Route 4 is closed. The NTSB says they do not have an alternative route picked out, as that would be up to the FAA. But an aviation expert tells us this collision could have been avoided if these changes were made sooner.
We can't sit back and wait for a later report. We got to call it right now. We got to say there's action needed and hope that the FAA is listening and responds accordingly. But they're sounding the alarm right now, saying enough's enough.
The Department of Transportation did temporarily restrict helicopter traffic in that area immediately following the January 29th crash. On Tuesday, the DOT announced that they would continue with those restrictions while the NTSB waits to see if the FAA will make those permanent to avoid close encounters between aircraft and helicopters. Now, DOT Secretary Sean Duffy said having helicopters fly down the same path as landing aircraft is like threading a needle, and he questions why the FAA didn't make changes years earlier after thousands of reported close encounters.
How did the FAA not know? How did they not study the data to say, hey, this is a hot spot, we're having near misses, and if we don't change our way, we're going to lose lives? That wasn't done. Maybe there was a focus on something other than safety.
And now the NTSB is looking into busy airspaces not only around Reagan National, but other airports across the country. So here are the next steps in that investigation. The NTSB says it will include flight simulations, interviews, and evaluating data that was captured by the aircraft's electronics. But a final report is not expected for at least a year. When we return, our investigative team sits down with the NTSB to break down one of the key pieces of this investigation, the flight recorder. A critical part of the NTSB's investigation revolves around the flight recorder, what is commonly called the black box. The NTSB says in their report, the black box combined cockpit voice and flight data recorder does not actually record date, time information, or helicopter position information, adding even more work for the investigators. Inconsistency in the data for pressure altitude values has led the NTSB to declare it as invalid. Sean Logging sits down with the NTSB to explain how the black boxes could be a major factor in determining the cause of the crash.
This is video from the NTSB after the flight recorder or black box was recovered from Flight 5342 and investigators started working on it.
I would say they're critical, and that's because a lot of the times that information isn't available from any other source. So we're getting a contemporaneous account of what's going on.
Chris Babcock is the Vehicle Recorder Division Branch Chief with the NTSB. He says what we commonly call a black box is two separate devices. The cockpit voice recorder,
recording audio and conversation that's occurring on the flight deck of the airplane. So we're listening to the captain and the first officer and any jump seat occupant that might be present, as well as any sounds that the airplane itself is making, any alerts or horns.
And the flight data recorder with information on airspeed, altitude, and GPS.
The behavior of the aircraft systems, what the airplane is doing in space and time.
The cockpit voice recorder, or CVR, records up to 2 hours of audio, with the earliest recording being overwritten with the newest. The flight data recorder, or FDR, records up to 25 hours of data, with some nearly 90 different data streams recorded on newer aircraft. They're also made to be durable.
They're required to sustain an impact force of over 3,000 times the force of gravity and have that data still survive. In addition, they're exposed to extreme heat, upwards of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
When recovered from a crash, care is taken to make sure it's protected. If recovered from water, the flight recorder is kept in water until it's back at the lab, as you can see here. That's when it's disassembled, cleaned, and repaired before investigators start working on the data.
We'll take apart that crash-protected housing, so we're down to the memory chips level to make sure there's no dissolved solids that might be present, there's no short circuits that might be present. It's a very thorough and rigorous inspection and repair process.
Babcock says throughout the investigative process, the data will be used to reach conclusions and determine probable cause. For Fact Finder, Sean Logging, 12 News.
It's a challenging airport. It has been for a long time, and it's time we addressed some of the issues there.
So to come, we will hear from a former NTSB board member who shares the challenges of making recommendations to the FAA. The preliminary report into the tragedy involving Flight 5342 is only the beginning of the investigation. It could take years for a final report to be released. That report would list the cause of the crash and issue more recommendations to prevent similar accidents in the future. But our national investigative team found those recommendations often sit in limbo for years, with some critical safety measures never being adopted. Since the year 2000, the agency has issued nearly 1,400 directives specifically to the FAA, but more than 350 have been closed without the requested remedies. Another nearly 200 recommendations are still open. Now, the NTSB can make any recommendation they see fit, but there are factors that limit the FAA's ability to act. The biggest factor is the cost. A former NTSB board member tells us it weighs heavily on the minds of board members to balance the cost of what they recommend and how timely it could be implemented by the FAA.
So it doesn't do us any good to send a recommendation to the FAA that we know, because of the cost, is not going to get enacted.
Yeah.
So if we want to make an impact on safety, we need to scale that back and give them a recommendation that they can accomplish.
Now, John Golia was a NTSB board member from 1995 to 2004, but he spent 60 years in the aviation industry. During his time on the board, Golia said he once made a recommendation that would have cost 7 figures. Now, legally, the FAA is required to do a cost-benefit analysis to prove that the benefits of change outweigh the price. Now, he believes many recommendations will come from this tragedy, and he hopes to see the FAA approve them all. But it could take years for that to happen. And while Golia is no longer a board member, he said one suggestion he'd make to the FAA would be for daylight-only operations for one of the runways at Reagan Airport.
Runway 33, the one runway that they were lining up to, is a daylight-only operation, not nighttime. And the reason why I would say that is that whole eastern bank of the Potomac River there is so lit up because it's all government buildings. It is like daylight over there. It ruins your night vision. It makes it very, very difficult to come around.
Now, the NTSB said in their report that 2/3 of the incidents at Reagan Airport where a helicopter was too close and triggering a traffic collision avoidance system advisory were reported at night. And the NTSB has already laid out their next steps in the investigation. Now, Kansas lawmakers are making sure all policies are thoroughly examined to prevent future tragedies. Later this month, Senator Jeremy Moran will be holding a hearing to go over that preliminary finding. That hearing will take place on March 27th at 10 a.m. Senator Moran and a subcommittee will work to determine policy changes and how to make the airspace around Reagan Airport less congested.
So by then, perhaps there will be more information. And in fact, the NTSB indicates in this preliminary report that they intend to do simulation and other tests to get additional information. The takeaway at the moment is the helicopters, when planes are landing or taking off, should not be in the path that they were in that night. And it was permissible for them to be there, but it shouldn't have been.
And legal action is also being taken by the families of the victims. Clifford Law Office, that's in Chicago, last month filed a pre-case claim against the FAA and the U.S. Army for $250 million. It's also sent letters to American Airlines, regional carrier PSA, and others to preserve evidence in the mid-air crash. After the break, we look ahead to the next generation of pilots being trained right here in Wichita and how they evaluate aviation accidents as part of their lesson. With such a rich history in aviation, the city of Wichita, the air capital, unfortunately has had its share of air tragedies, crashes that have left a lasting impression, much like Flight 5342. As Michael Schwenke shows us, some were so big, they led to change.
We heard a big boom and a cloud of smoke.
Very, very tragic incidents.
The heat, the smell, the fumes, the jet fuel was very prevalent.
The deadliest aviation disaster in Kansas took place 60 years ago. January 15th, 1965, a Boeing KC-135 refueling tanker took off from McConnell Air Force Base and gained a little altitude. It was carrying more than 30,000 gallons of fuel. 3 minutes later, it crashed into a neighborhood at 20th and Piatt, a few blocks east of I-135. 7 airmen and 23 people on the ground died. The cause of the crash was never determined. October 2nd, 1970, it was a clear and beautiful fall day when Wichita State football departed on 2 planes to a game in Utah. One plane took a scenic route. but it flew too low to gain altitude to climb out of the canyon and over the Rocky Mountains. 31 people died in the crash, including coaches, local leaders, and star athletes. However, there were survivors.
You know, there's those you're looking down and we're looking up.
Some, like Rick Stevens, have made it a tradition to hike up the mountain to visit the site of the crash.
I got it. Don't worry about it. Get back up, buddy.
To this day, you can see pieces of the wreckage off of I-70, just as it stood decades ago.
You just get a sense of amazement that anybody survived.
Pieces of the plane, mementos, all to honor those in a crash that shouldn't have happened. There were other crashes involving other sports programs. 6 weeks later, Marshall University chartered a flight after a game. All 75 people were killed. Sometime later, the NCAA changed regulations for schools to prevent similar tragedies.
And in recent years, there have been a handful of small plane crashes in the region. One of the most significant took place on October 30th, 2014. A plane took off from Mid-Continent Airport, but shortly after, it slammed into the flight training building nearby. The pilot died, and so did 3 people inside the building. For future aviators, moments like these have become powerful lessons in our flight training schools.
Rick Blyseth is the chief flight instructor at WSU Tech. He's helped train the next generation of pilots for over 2 decades.
We run them through real-world scenarios that they might encounter, and then that's reinforced in the airplane.
He works hands-on with the dozens of students in the program, both up in the air and on the ground in the classroom.
We actually have a safety and human factors course that does nothing but look at scenarios that have happened.
Different sections that go through different parts of it.
Safety is top priority when flying an aircraft. It's why when tragic incidents occur, such as the deadly mid-air collision over the Potomac River, flight instructors like Blyseth use it as a teaching moment.
But we do look at circumstances that might lead to certain things and you know, talk about those, discuss those in class.
We have safety briefings built into every single lesson that the students do.
Immediately following the crash, Jim Hall, the vice president of aviation for WSU Tech, says they issued a safety stand down that went to every department in the program. Detailed discussions between instructors and students to understand why aviation accidents occur and what could be done through training to make sure they don't happen again.
And students are here to learn. How do I prevent something like that from happening? I don't want to contribute to that because I know what I do matters. Lives are in my hand.
For flight programs, it has been an opportunity to use real-world experiences to reinforce their safety measures.
We bring them right to the forefront and make sure that all of our students understand how things like this can happen and how they are preventable and how it's their responsibility to make sure things like that don't happen.
As our investigation continues and we search for answers to why this crash happened, we take time to reflect on the 67 lives that were lost that night. For weeks, travelers passing through Eisenhower Airport in Wichita left notes, flowers, and photos showing their love and support. Those mementos have been saved and will be used for a permanent memorial honoring those victims, and many of you helping the families involved as well. $200,000 have been raised through the ICT Together Fund. That money will start being dispersed to the victims' families this month for financial support, and that is how you can help out right there, icttogether.org. May we never forget the 67 people on board both aircraft that lost their lives January 29th. They were teachers, parents, students, advocates, skaters, and loved ones, and they will all be missed.